Welcome back to PROtalks. My name is Nate Halubka and I work within the North Carolina Pandemic Recovery Office. And in this particular PROtalk, what we're going to be given is the roadmap to recovering lost revenue. So this actually builds on a last presentation that we had. In that one, we talked about the NEU's major categories that they can actually spend their funds on. And like we said in that one, we were getting a lot of questions about revenue loss. So in this particular one, we're going to go and give a little bit deeper dive into revenue loss.
There really is kind of a linear process that helps walk you through how you start to calculate revenue loss for your municipality. Now, to get us down that roadmap, the first thing that we need to do is look at some definitions. We've had a lot of questions from NEUs asking about external sources. And really what we're seeing from the U.S. Treasury is that that's not the case. So we're not talking about grant funds or external funds that you're calculated somewhere else. We're really talking about revenue that's generated from economic activity that's available for the government services. Now, specifically, you're not allowed to use things like proceeds from insurance of debt, sale of investments, agencies and private trust transactions, refunds and corrections of transactions, and revenue from utilities and other trusts. We're really talking about kind of the tax revenue that NEUs create. So the first step was in kind of defining what revenue loss was. Now let's look at the second step, which is looking at what some of those expenditure areas are that are not allowed. There's a common misperception out there that you're going to be able to use the funds in any way that you want. So let's go ahead and dispel a few of those. Paying for interest or principal on outstanding debt isn't allowed. Replenishing rainy day funds and other reserve funds also disallowed. Repaying settlements and judgments or short-term revenue or tax anticipation notes are specifically disallowed by the U.S. Treasury. Paying fees or insurance costs from insurance of new debt, and overarching restrictions on program funds, such as restrictions on a pension deposit or on using funds for non-federal match were barred by the regulation. So those are a handful of things that we know right now that the U.S. Treasury said are not allowable.
So let's move into the next phase of this, which is starting to calculate your revenue. If you'll look at our pro tips, we've provided a few links to help kind of walk through this. And rather than recreate the wheel, we're going to point you towards some good tips to help you with this. The first is a revenue calculator, which has been produced by the National League of Cities. If you click onto the link that we've provided and then go about halfway down on the page, you'll be able to access an Excel-based revenue calculator, which we think is pretty robust. So we'd encourage you to take a look at that. The second is we understand that this PROtalk is relatively short and maybe not go into the depth that you may be looking for. So we provided a link through the National Association of Counties, which is a much longer webinar and goes into greater depth with that. So as you're calculating your revenue, please feel free to check that out as more in-depth information. And then finally, whenever you're calculating this, if you are a member of the Government of Finance Officers Association, the members for that group can actually access a different calculator. So all three of those have been provided. Let's move on to the last step. Now, by this point, you've now calculated your revenue and you're actually getting into the phase to being able to start to look at how you can spend those lost revenues. Now, again, we've said this before, but I want to make sure that it gets out there. You cannot just take the revenue recaptured and spend it on anything that you want. The U.S. Treasury has set some guardrails on how you can spend these funds, and we're going to briefly go through those. So you can use them towards maintenance of infrastructure or pay-as-you-go for new infrastructure, including roads. This is one thing. So long as you've recaptured this revenue, you can use those towards roads. Second is modernization of cybersecurity, including hardware, software, and protections for other critical infrastructure. Health services are allowable. Environmental remediation, school and education services, and then for the provision of fire, police, and safety services. Now, what all of these areas kind of encapsulate, from what we can tell, is the U.S. Treasury is saying that you can use this lost revenue to cover some of those basic services that government entities provide. Now, so whenever you're looking at it from a general frame, look at it from that standpoint instead of just it is funds that can be used towards anything. Thank you for joining us with this PROtalk as we take a look into revenue replacement. Stay tuned as our next videos will likely start to go into more depth with some of the other category areas. As always, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us at NCPro, and our email address is provided here. Until next time, this is Nate Halubka, and thank you. Goodbye.